Uh, as it's usual, I project my text uh, in English, but I speak in Portuguese. It's just a way to keep also my language and to give opportunity to more people to be engaged. This was something that we started when we started the project. We thought about, and you continued it. So, bom dia, boa tarde e boa noite a todos e todas. Bem-vindos à terceira sessão no segundo semestre do ciclo de encontros Gender Study and Classical Scholarship, organizado pelo EuGeSta, como parte de um novo projeto ligado aos estudos de gênero e aos estudos clássicos. EuGeSta é uma rede europeia de estudos de gênero na antiguidade que foi fundada pela professora Jacqueline Fabre-Serris, uma latinista. A rede traz pessoas de várias áreas de estudos da antiguidade, incluindo estudos de língua, literatura, arqueologia, economia, direito, medicina, filosofia, história da arte, religião e estudos de recepção. E todos eles compartilham, né, esse interesse comum nos estudos de gênero. Em 2011, foi criado um jornal de acesso livre, né, com o mesmo nome, cujas editoras são a professora Jacqueline Fabre-Serris e a professora Judith Hallett. Vocês podem ter mais informações sobre esse projeto no sítio no portal, né, do EuGeSta. Nesse ano, numa nova fase da rede, né, de pesquisa EuGeSta, outros projetos tiveram início e um desses projetos foi esse ciclo de encontro, cujo objetivo é divulgar publicações importantes na área de estudos de gênero, ocorrendo a cada 2 meses. Depois de 2 sessões, né, nos 4 meses passados, que foram gravadas e estão todas disponíveis no canal do YouTube do projeto. Nós começamos agora o segundo semestre com as atividades, né, com a apresentação de mais 2 livros por seus autores e comentários por pesquisadores convidados. As sessões vão seguir, né, como nas sessões prévias, essa mesma estrutura, então, uma breve apresentação feita por mim, seguida de a apresentação das primeiras palestrantes por 15 minutos, depois a segunda palestrante, autora também do livro, e, posteriormente, os comentários das convidadas. E no final, a gente tem cerca de 25 minutos para questões que podem ser apresentadas pelo chat ou por microfone. Então, a sessão toda dura 1h20, nós podemos ainda ficar 10 minutos, se for necessário, né? Eu não vou ser draconiana, mas eu espero que todos, né, cooperem e façam também perguntas, questões objetivas. Essa é uma atividade multilingüe, o inglês é a língua mais comumente usada por palestrantes e respondentes, mas todos os participantes são bem-vindos para falar o seu idioma, né? A única coisa que pedimos para facilitar é a projeção do texto em inglês. Com esse formato, nós acreditamos que podemos estimular interações, né, entre os participantes e dar visibilidade a trabalhos de pessoas de várias partes do mundo. Eu chamo a atenção apenas para o fato de que os respondentes, né, eles vão tratar de algum aspecto do livro, não é uma resenha, não é um comentário extensivo do livro, né? Nessa nossa terceira sessão, nós temos, né, 2 livros publicados recentemente. O primeiro, Ancient Women Philosophers, foi editado por Katharine e por Caterina Pellò, e tem 12 capítulos, né, que tratam de mulheres na cultura indiana, chinesa e greco-romana, né? A professora Katharine é professora assistente de filosofia na Toronto Metropolitan University, onde ela ensina filosofia moral, ética, estudos de gêneros e outros aspectos da filosofia. E a professora Caterina Pellò é professora associada no Departamento de Grego e Latim da University College of London, e onde ela ensina filosofia e também língua grega e latina. A respondente é a professora Sara Brill, que falou na nossa sessão inaugural, né, no dia 8 de março, no semestre passado. A professora Brill, ela ensina História da Filosofia e Filosofia Social e Política na Universidade da Fairfield University. O segundo livro é uma monografia, né, sobre uma mulher bastante famosa, né, trabalhadora do sexo na antiguidade. E ele é intitulado Phryne, A Life in Fragments. Foi publicado por Melissa Funke e ela é professora na Universidade de Winnipeg, onde trabalha com fragmentos de tragédias gregas, estudos de gênero e sexualidade na antiguidade, literatura grega e romana e também termos gregos, né, relativo às cores. A respondente de Melissa é a doutora Stefania Giombini, uma classicista italiana e também filósofa, com uma formação em filosofia e direito, mas que é professora no Departamento de Direito na Universidade Autônoma de Barcelona, aqui na Espanha. Antes de eu passar a palavra a elas, eu gostaria de agradecer a Daniela Brinatti, estudante de pós-graduação na Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, onde eu também trabalho, e ao Caio Franco Assunção, que é um estudante de graduação no Departamento de Filosofia na mesma universidade. Então, obrigada a eles pela assistência técnica. E, por fim, eu quero reforçar, né, que muitas dessas atividades do projeto EuGeSta, e mais uma vez agradeço à professora Jacqueline Fabre pela oportunidade de participar desse projeto, né? Mas as atividades podem ser acessadas no site, né? E a nossa quarta sessão já está agendada, a última desse ano, para novembro, dia 27 de novembro, né? E teremos mais dois livros, né, muito interessantes a ser discutidos. Então, não, né, agora é hora de passar a palavra, né, para Catarina e Catherine. Obrigada mais uma vez. E Catherine, please.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thanks so much to the organisers for having us, to Maria for chairing, and to Sara for agreeing to comment. We're really thrilled to have the volume featured in this great series. So I'll briefly introduce our project as a whole, some of its objectives and key questions in the book. So as Maria said, our book is an edited collection of essays on women in the ancient Greek, Roman, Chinese, Islamic, and Indian philosophical traditions. And in it, we pay special attention to these women's philosophical achievements, so their novel arguments and where extant their writings. And this takes different shapes in different schools and different stages in the history of classical philosophy. It ranges from close argument analysis of philosophical texts in some cases, to studies of ancient philosophical communities that included women, as well as philosophical readings of works like ancient biography, novel, and poems. So the chapters each focus on a woman or a group of women and are written by a scholar specializing in that relevant area. And we had three main aims with this book project. The first is recovering the thought of ancient women philosophers and including them in the canon of the history of philosophy. The second is analyzing the available evidence and the strategies we might use to access these women's ideas. And the third is making available this material for researchers, teachers, and students of philosophy. With respect to the first aim, I should first make clear the nature of the challenge that we face, because our sources suggest that there were no women engaging in philosophical activity alongside men in antiquity. And it's certainly true that we have no texts that are uncontestably ascribed to women philosophers. So there are texts such as the letters and treatises ascribed to the Pythagorean women in the 1st century BCE, but their authenticity is debated. We have, for example, the writings of Ban Shao in the classical Chinese tradition, but their philosophical nature is contested. So overall, there's little to no direct evidence from ancient women thinkers, and the available indirect evidence is either fragmentary or of dubious reliability. So we're really left with a list of names and very limited information about these women's lives and moreover their intellectual activities, all of which has been written by and preserved by men. So the result is that the thought of ancient women philosophers remains very little researched and rarely taught. And our goal in this project was to try to change that and fill this gap, and in many ways celebrate the fact that there were women working in the ancient philosophical tradition in all of these traditions. So pursuing this goal requires careful assessment of the available evidence and really the use of a range of methodological strategies to try to access these women's ideas, with this being the state of the evidence. In our introduction, Caterina and I argue that the kind of methodological issues this type of work raises and forces us to confront is in fact a strength of this material, because it requires that we articulate and refine, and in some cases, really rethink the methodology of the history of philosophy. And that has women or any particular group. So for today, I wanted to briefly mention some of those methodological issues that work on ancient women philosophers raises and makes more urgent, but that we think have a sort of wide-ranging remit. So these are questions like, to what extent does it matter that these thinkers are women? And if it does, why does it matter? Should we be interested in these women primarily insofar as they are women, or is there some other justification for our interest? Should we expect to find in these thinkers' work some kind of distinctively female perspective? What does it mean for a woman, or for any ancient thinker for that matter, to be a philosopher? Who counts as a philosopher? On what grounds can we exclude a work or a subject matter as not being philosophical? Is philosophy dependent on certain genres of writing, or can it be expressed alternatively? Can it be expressed through lifestyle, for example? How should we approach texts whose philosophical status, authenticity, or dating is contested, or maybe all of those are contested? Should our approach to these types of texts be any different if they are our only evidence of a certain thinker or a marginalized category of thinker? How should we approach evidence of ancient women philosophers which exists only in male-authored works? To what extent are we entitled to use fictional or fictionalized figures as evidence of the thought of ancient women philosophers or another group? Do cases of communally authored works, such as we find in the classical Indian tradition, help with or make more pressing these questions of the importance of an identifiable authorship and a gender ascription? Is it possible or legitimate to use biographical evidence as evidence for the philosophical, and especially where we lack other resources? Is the history of philosophy overly focused on the attribution of ideas and doctrines to specific individuals? What happens if we shift the unit of ascription to communities of thought, including unnamed or marginalized members of those communities? And what do we gain by considering lost texts, or the wider question of why so few texts by ancient women have reached us? So these are all questions which are dealt with in the chapters in the volume, and we ask the contributors, where appropriate, to include discussion of their methodologies and some metaphilosophical reflections on the challenges they face and the strategies they used. And we analysed many of these in our introduction, though there are undoubtedly more than we could cover. It's quite rich across those different traditions. We find these questions philosophically provocative, and we argue in our introduction that some of the unique value of working on these figures is that these questions that are raised in the course of doing so will sharpen and impact our thinking beyond these specific texts or specific figures. They sharpen our approaches to philosophical thinking more generally. So that brings me to our final aim, which is to make this material available to researchers, teachers, and students. And it is our goal to encourage work on these figures and to an extent add an injunction that they be included in our teaching of this period. So in addition to bringing these texts together and making them accessible to a range of levels of students and teachers, I think the methodological discussions, if they're successful, hopefully remove some of the justification for excluding these figures. Even where texts are lacking or deemed insufficient, we can have these rich discussions about what gets preserved, what counts as philosophical or not, and what makes something worthy of the canon. So I'll stop there and I'll now pass to Caterina, who will highlight some of the chapters of our volume.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And again, thank you for this event, for organizing it, for inviting us. Thank you to Sarah. I'll be very brief. So after Catherine's methodological introduction, I thought I would just sort of talk you through our project and give you an overview of the chapters or what's included. Very briefly, so we started working on this volume in 2020, sort of pre-pandemic, and initially our aim was sort of twofold. So on the one hand, given that most of the existing scholarship on women in ancient philosophy focused on ancient philosophical theories about women rather than by women, we thought we would edit a book on sort of historical real-life women philosophers and what they thought. Second, given that those scholars who did write about women philosophers, ancient women philosophers, primarily because of the nature of the evidence gave sort of biographical accounts of these figures, we wanted to focus on their ideas, on their sort of novel philosophical theories and arguments, on their original contributions to the history of philosophy. Now, 2 months into the project, we realized that these aims had to be fine-tuned in a sense. So first of all, as Catherine mentioned, as we expected, we were facing a very challenging source issue. So we spent a lot of our time was spent on a careful evaluation of the available sources, which means not simply that we didn't want to be too picky, but also that we realized that writing about women philosophers included a reflection on indirect accounts on women philosophers, as well as fictional ones, as well as biographical and doxographical sources, to see what they can teach us about real-life women and what makes them philosophically interesting. And second, we sort of agreed on what we wanted the philosophical takeaways of the volume to be. On the one hand, this was about introducing new figures, new ideas, new texts to study, research, and teach. But as Catherine again mentioned, we also wanted this to be about an opportunity to reflect on how we do history of philosophy more broadly. So studying women philosophers, engaging with the available evidence, prompted us to sort of redefine our more general methodology and the value of women philosophers, not just for the history of philosophy, but for how we do history of philosophy. Okay, so very briefly on the protagonists of our volume, I'll share the table of contents. Just a second. Okay, I hope it works. So we have, as Maria mentioned, we have 12 chapters which are organized chronologically, each focusing either on a philosopher or a group of women philosophers. We start with 2 chapters that are somehow sort of parallel chapters. They both revolve around the question of whether women have a distinctive ways of philosophizing or did so in antiquity. And they answer this question, interestingly, with 2 examples from 2 different philosophical traditions in ancient Greece and ancient India. So the first chapter by Frisby Sheffield focuses on Diotima, and the second by Brian Black on Sulaba. In both cases, the conclusion, the author do not necessarily focus on whether these women were sort of really existed, but on the implications of these 2 episodes and of the gender identities of the protagonist on the sort of way women did philosophy at the time. And the conclusion is that in antiquity, philosophy was portrayed as being beyond the dualities of gender distinctions. Chapter 3 focuses on another group of female intellectuals, women physicians. Now, the mutual influence and dialogue between ancient philosophy and medicine is well established. What Sophia Connell does in the chapter is to look at references throughout the Hippocratic corpus to women practicing medicine or theorizing about the human body and human health. And she realizes, so she discovers that the female expertise is not exclusively about the female-related topics, such as gynecology or fertility, but also includes more general and genderless discussion about pharmacology or the nature of disease. Then we have 3 chapters on Hellenistic philosophy and the notion of philosophy as a way of life. So chapter 4 on the Epicurean women by Kelly Aronson, chapter 5 on Arete of Cyrene, so the Cyrenaics, written by Catherine O'Reilly, and chapter 6 on women in Stoicism by Kate Russell. Chapters 7 and 8 focus on the Pythagorean women, which is possibly the sort of best known, most debated case of female engagement with ancient Greek philosophers. Now we have this group of texts from Antiquity that are ascribed to Pythagorean women philosophers. Most scholars focus on the authenticity of these texts, whether they were in fact written by women. We wanted to focus on the content. So we have a chapter on the letters on home economics by Rosemary Toomey, and a chapter on a treatise titled On Wisdom that I wrote with Julia de Cesaris, and that is about sort of the object of philosophy and why we should pursue it. 9 by Anna Christensen focuses on the dialogue about the nature and immortality of the soul between Macrina and her brother Gregory of Nyssa, arguing for the intellectual dependence of Macrina. Chapter 10 on Neoplatonism, Hypatia and Sisipatra. The chapter is written by Jana Schultz and focuses on the ideas of these 2 women, but also on how they embody and influence the Neoplatonic ideals of womanhood. And then we have a chapter on Banzhao by Anne Pan-White. So in the case of Banzhao, Banzhao is a Confucian thinker who authored several texts. So we do have texts, but as Catherine said, these texts have never been read philosophically. And so what Anne Pan-White does is to sort of reconstruct Banzhao's argument on gender and the female role in society and the role of harmony in the household. And finally, we close with a chapter by Peter Adamson on the reception of Plato's argument on women's ability to philosophize in the Republic, the reception in Neoplatonism, Proclus, in the Islamic philosopher Averroes, Ibn Rashid, and the early modern feminist Lucrezia Marinella. So again, the focus here is on something that was wrote about women, but the way in which this argument was, how this argument was received is sort of influenced and influences the historical women of their time throughout the history of philosophy. So that's it. I close by saying that I think what we learned with this project is sort of how wide and various are the contributions of women to the history of ancient philosophy. And also that we are sort of aware that this list is not exhaustive, that there are plenty of other figures we could include. And so the hope is to sort of prompt more research in the field, and that there will soon be the need of an updated volume. But thank you very much.
Thank you both. And now I give the floor to Sara Brill. Please, Sara.
Thank you so much, Cecília, and thank you to you and Jacqueline for your organization of this wonderful event. Thank you to all of you for being here, but especially thank you to Caterina and Catherine for your fantastic collection. It is such an enormous pleasure to read and engage with. I have notes, stars, exclamation points. I've paced the room. I've sat and stared. In terms of generating thinking and conversation, it's a pivotal volume. Especially you are to be commended for the breadth of your work as well, for taking antiquity beyond Greek antiquity and allowing us to really think about the methodological questions that arise when we do that. You've given us just a very rich feast of ideas. I'm very grateful to you both. My comments today, honestly, will really pick up on some of the methodological questions that you raised in your introduction. Perhaps no surprise there, but I do think you offer us a very rich meditation on why it is important to do this work, and a series of invitations to think further. And I'd like to pick up on 3 of those invitations just to highlight them, amplify them to the extent that I can, but then also counter-invite you to say a little bit more about them if there's opportunity and time and if you have interest. So the first one that I thought we could talk about a bit with today would be precisely this conjunction of a study of women philosophers in antiquity and what it means to do the history of philosophy. I thought you were working in the introduction very much in the spirit of philosopher Maria Rosa Antognazza. She concludes her study of the value of the history of philosophy for philosophy as such with this really interesting observation. I'll go ahead and read that observation and then say a little more about how I see it at work and what you're doing. Her argument is that the history of philosophy has, and this is her words, an innovative and subversive potential. She continues, it trains the mind to think alternatively about problems of enduring philosophical relevance and to remain alert to the danger of intellectual dogmatism of the latest orthodoxy. A bit later, she concludes, insofar as the history of philosophy contributes in a distinctive way to the forging of critical distance, it contributes to the aims of philosophy as such. So I thought this phrase, the forging of critical distance, was really interesting to think of in the context of a claim that the 2 of you make in the introduction very early on. And I'll cite the 2 of you. We, Caterina and Katharine, argue that the study of ancient women philosophers has a special value for our understanding of the history of philosophy. And I'm very much inclined to agree and also interested in thinking more about why that's the case. You go on to locate in the introduction this special value on both methodological and ethical registers, forges critical distance in a variety of ways methodologically, making scholars less dogmatic, more nuanced, more aware of the conditions of the composition of text, more aware of the question of what constitutes a text. In this, your work is also, I think, to be commended for the contribution it offers to a larger historicizing effort to understand marginalized figures and the conditions of their marginalization without contributing to the conditions of those marginalization. And here we do really encounter, I think, a profound philosophic question. If the language utilized to designate who is and is not a philosopher, who is and is not a thinker, is itself generated by mechanisms of marginalization, then utilizing that language risks furthering those mechanisms. And the need then for a critical eye is very powerful. So is the need for a critical eye for the absence of vocabulary. And here, as you rightly point out, Miranda Fricker has done such wonderful work in pointing to the ways in which a lack of vocabulary impoverishes our understanding of lived experience. And Fricker documents this very nicely, the way that certain experiences speak to and point to an absence of vocabulary. So I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on how to fill the lacuna doing here brings to that. That bears then on the second point of intersection, this sort of ethical register of the work that you're doing and the reparative project more broadly. You make a powerful argument that a kind of neutral stance that would operate as though, because we cannot track women philosophers in the way that we do other kinds of philosophers or other philosophical texts, that we operate as though they didn't exist is simply no longer a tenable approach to take. So you provide a very nice argument for why it would no longer be okay to not attend to this, to whatever record we do possess. And I think that that's a powerful and important point, that there is not a kind of a stance that asserts that we can't study these figures is not a stance that is neutral with respect to what constitutes philosophy or one's own assumptions about what philosophy is. So I think that that's a powerful ethical register of your overarching connection between doing history of philosophy and studying Greek or studying women philosophers in antiquity. That verges on a second invitation that you give to us, and that is an invitation to linger over and examine more thoroughly the structural conditions that produce the marginalization of women philosophers. And here I'd like to cite you again. I thought this was quite a powerful passage in the introduction. So When we look across the oeuvre of ancient women generally, we think it is and should be shocking how little direct evidence of their thought is available to us. To dismiss this worry quickly by pointing out that many works by men are also missing too prevents us from inquiring further into the historical and cultural forces that have resulted in the current loss. We urge scholars not to shy away from this issue. So I think that that's a powerful point that you're making, and an important one, and I'm delighted to see it made. It also makes one think about this very careful balance of attending to the work of women philosophers, but also attending to the ways that each of the words in the title that you produce have both oppressive and liberatory possibilities, that a gender binary is used as a tool of oppression, and that also a desire to be invisible can be a strategy for carving out livable lives under particular political circumstances. And so not only do we have to figure in the way that patriarchal structures erase women, we also have to figure in the way in which women attempted to carve out those livable lives by not attaining a certain degree of visibility. And so I think that's just an interesting difficulty and a rich topic for conversation. I'm hoping that you might have something to say about that in our discussion. Then just a final point, a final invitation to address. So you also offer us an invitation to move away from a kind of great minds paradigm, or a kind of individual genius model that is, a relic of 17th, 18th, and 19th century German Romanticism in many ways. So I think that this point about the a focus on the singularity of philosophic thinkers is also really important, and what it would mean then to take seriously texts that are produced anonymously, texts that are produced collectively, the way in which A Manner of Life could be a text that is analyzed. So all of those questions, I think, come to this very nice point in thinking really carefully about what it comes to mean to do work on figures like Plato and Aristotle in light of the repertory work that you want to do. So how our understanding of even canonical figures is altered by taking seriously the claims that you make about women philosophers. That's, I think, a lot to throw on your table. So I'll stop here and just hope that we have opportunity for further conversation. Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much, Sara. Well, after the other presentation, then I'll give time to both to discuss. So now, as planned, we change to Melissa to present her book. Thank you, Melissa, please.
Of course, I forgot to unmute. So thank you to the organizers and to Stefania. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. I've really been enjoying the conversation so far. It's obviously very resonant for me when we talk about recovering what we do have or working with fragmentary material. So I'd like to start by talking about and looking at one of Elsa Frann's fictional letters. And this was, in fact, my own first exposure to Phryne. And so this letter is part of a 2nd century CE epistolary collection. It's set in a comic version of classical Athens. And the first 3 books of the collection are written by fishermen, farmers, and parasites, and they could have stepped off the comic stage. But the 4th book of this collection turns to historical but very fictionalized hetairai, so upscale sex workers, and it gives voice to some of the most famous women of the 4th century BCE. So the letter we see here is from Phryne to her supposed lover, the sculptor Praxiteles, and she writes to him, I'll put that in quotation marks, "Don't be afraid, for you have brought to fruition an absolutely beautiful thing, such a thing as no one ever saw of all the things made by hand. You have dedicated your very own hetaira in the sacred precinct, for I stand in the middle by Aphrodite together with your Eros. But don't refuse me the honor, for those who gaze at us praise Praxiteles, and because of your art the Thespians don't think me unworthy to be placed among the gods. One thing still remains for your gift, that you come to us so that we may lie with each other in the sacred precinct, for we will not stain the gods whom we ourselves have created. Farewell." So this Phryne, the one that we find in this letter, is very aware of the anecdotes surrounding her and the persona that they've created. Also, the poetry that links her to the famous sculptor, and of course, the artworks that are connected to her. She's talking about a set of 3 statues in a sanctuary of her. She is indelible. She's a woman who is situated in a very specific place and time, who is unafraid to express her desire directly to her lover. But how did sort of the real Phryne, that 4th century sex worker, become this version of herself? And that's really what I'm interested in this book, is to figure out how she became sort of the exemplar of the grand hetaira, who is so enmeshed in the cultural products of the classical period. And I want to also think about the challenging complexities from her own life that were discarded in the telling and retelling of her stories, as each new author in the Hellenistic and then the imperial period took her up as a means of conjuring the literary dreamscape of classical Athens. So the most important question of the book is really, when a life has been reduced to fragments, how do we reckon with the desire that we have for the whole woman? And so desire is a theme that I think through in the book. I'm largely concerned with answering those questions by sort of tracing that literary process of fragmentation that brings the version of Phryne from the letter to us. I want to think about how her presence in ancient literature departs from more traditional biography. And so in this sense, I argue that she's representative of the classical hetairae as a class, of all of those upscale sex workers. And also that when we look at that evidence for the classical hetairae, there's a unique melding of social history and the literary record with this group of women. So I argue that we have to see Phryne's biographical tradition as a product of intentional fragmentation, and that we can think of fragments and the way that sex workers are written about in this way as its own kind of genre of literature. And that is because fragments, just like the hetairae, are objects of desire. Here I build on Camelia Elias's idea of a coercive fragment. This is a fragment from the ancient world that suggests a presupposed whole from which it has then been coerced into detachment. So when we read these fragments, we're sort of contemplating a whole of some kind. And of course, that's the desire to consume and apprehend the content of that material. But it's equally important, of course, that as we have this desire, that we reckon with the means by which the fragment was produced and reproduced, and then how that process has shaped the narrative that we now have. So in the case of the fragments preserving the anecdotes of the hetairae, the process of coercive separation and the nostalgic motivations behind it are the things that drive the way we fictionalize their stories, the way we depart from their historical lives. And so again, the book is tracing that process of fragmentation from the 4th century into the Hellenistic period down to the Greek literature of the Roman Empire. And so I want to think of the ways that fragmentation defines the genre of pornography, so to speak. So I do talk about some of the basics of Phryne's life, some of the basic sort of contours. We know she was active in Athens during the middle of the 4th century BCE. We know that she was of Thespian origins, born prior to the 370s likely. Probably she was, although a career in sex work might also indicate that she was enslaved at some point. And so I use in the first chapter legal speeches from the 4th century featuring sex workers to speculate for various possibilities about the realities of Phryne's work that, of course, our later traditions do not address at all. We know that, for example, her birth name was Menesarete, and then she took the nickname Phryne, which means toad, because apparently she was so pale. I think it's very safe that we can say she was connected to the sculptor Praxiteles, and it's also very, very likely that she was brought to court probably in the 340s. So those are kind of the basic contours. But again, if we want to think about that process of fragmentation, we want to think about anecdotes and the way the anecdotes shape our tradition. So already within her own lifetime in the 4th century, Phryne was a public figure. So she was already sort of being shaped as an idea more than a real woman. So, for example, she's mentioned in 4th century comedies. They nod at her humble origins. They also call her a Charybdis that gulps down ship captains along with the ships. And of course, greed is one of the hallmarks of sex workers in literature, sort of broadly. A few generations later, by the time we get to Alexandria in the Hellenistic period, we have a playwright, Posidippus, who tells the story of her trial. And then we see the interest in her trial sort of picks up at this point. It gets told and retold, especially then down into the imperial period. Both Latin and Greek authors take it up. And of course, it's because they're fascinated by the legendary conclusion of this trial, in which Phryne's naked body was supposedly exposed to the jury of Athenian men, who immediately acquitted her upon seeing her beauty. The anecdotes we have speak of fabulous amounts of wealth, so that she could offer to restore the city walls of Thebes after Alexander had taken them down. She continues to be associated with Thespiae, which is very fortuitous because, of course, it's the hometown of the god Eros. That's where his sanctuary is. And Eros, of course, being sexual desire. Most of the hetairai who appear in these anecdotes, sort of from the Hellenistic period onward, are associated with philosophers. This is also true of Phryne, who famously fails to seduce Xenocrates. We would also expect these hetairai to be universally witty. So, of course, Phryne has a set of anecdotes where she can sort of get the best of the men who want to use her services. And then, of course, the most famous anecdotes, and the anecdotes I think that have been most influential, even down into the modern day, are those that link her to Praxiteles and to Apelles. And this is said to be connected to a moment when she emerged from the sea, when she was bathing at a religious festival, that she inspired these two very famous works of art. And you can see the copy, basically, of Apelles, Aphrodite rising from the sea, and then a copy of the Aphrodite Knidos. So we also see a link in Phryne's stories to her public presence and nudity. So there's a real emphasis on the sort of the reaction of people to her nude beauty. And so we see these stories begin to take on a life of their own in the imperial period, so that we, for example, get Phryne and Praxiteles put together as lovers, as we see in the letter from Alciphron. So it's that melding of woman and image and anecdote that really becomes the hallmark of Phryne's biographical tradition. So she becomes this sort of larger than life, incendiary beauty. We can sort of feel that we know what she looks like because we have these endless copies of artwork that represents her supposedly. We can kind of claim to know her intellect because of these anecdotes that focus on, sort of devastating repartee. But we know that she was sort of incendiary in a sense, even within her own lifetime. So we can't really appreciate those stories. And this is what I want to argue, is that there's sort of a parallel process that's happening with the way that Athens itself, and classical Athens, is turned into a dreamscape in the same way that Phryne is turned into a dream girl. So the stories I've just mentioned really were circulating in earnest by about the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria. And of course, at the same time, Athens had lost much of its political and economic sway at the same time, and the cultural center has now shifted to Alexandria. But because classical Athens is very central in literary, dramatic, philosophical canons, it becomes this sort of intellectual home for the educated elite across the Greek world. And so it gives them that cultural capital, but at the same time, a blank space. So when an author is picking it up and fictionalizing it, they have a lot of artistic space to recreate. So at the same time, the hetairai, the same thing is happening to them. And they are so closely linked to Athens that we can't separate out those two traditions. So I'm going to talk a little bit just about Phryne and sort of how this process of fragmentation begins. And so again, not very long after Phryne was alive, we see that sort of fragmentary process happening with the birth of the pornographic anecdote. And this, again, applies broadly to all of the hetairai. So one of our late 4th century playwrights, Lynceus of Samos, he's working in Athens. He's the first author who takes the hetairai of the comic stage and then combines them with the historical hetairai. And he puts them together in anecdotes that seem to be sort of drawn from gossip in Athens. His compilation was known as the Aponymoniumata, the Memoirs, and it was centered on the comic poet Diphilus and the hetairai Glycera. And so it seems to be that these are the anecdotes that set the standard for the later stories about love affairs between poets and artists and hetairai. And that idea that they must be more quick-witted than their lovers, these women, and that they can exercise the power of rhetoric in place of political power. So again, with the intellectual center of the Greek world shifting to Alexandria, poets there took up the anecdote, took it up from Lynceus, and at that point, they really solidified the generic expectations for concision, wit, notable names, and that upended power structure. So in the 3rd century, the anecdotes, we see them even being further condensed, concision of philosophical models, the crai, that seem to have been in circulation the century previous. So we have Macon, who writes a series of these crai and titles them that. In the century after, so the 2nd century BCE, the Alexandrians continue to be fascinated with the Hetairai, and they're continually associated with comedy in some way. So typically, if a scholar has an interest in the Hetairai, they also have an interest in comedy. So we see treatises written by the same figures about Hetairai and about comedy. And so again, in the 2nd century, the conventions of how to write about Hetairai, about women like Phryne, are very well established. And so the stories, the anecdotes about Phryne that I mentioned were probably already, circulating quite a bit by that point. In addition, we also have legal scholars who are very interested, of course, in court cases from the 4th century. And they're studying, for example, Phryne's case. So we have a pair of anonymous treatises from roughly the 2nd century BCE that narrate the conclusion of Phryne's trial as they consider supplication and despair. In addition to that, we start to see the literary record, and I mean that broadly, all the way back to Homer, making its way into these stories and being incorporated into stories of women like Phryne, so that by the time we have the story of Phryne being revealed at the end of her trial, we have bits of Sappho, we have bits of Stesichorus, bits of Homer kind of making their way into those stories as well. So we really see a really huge cultural footprint for the Hetairai that is reaching beyond just comedy at that point. Now, I want to sort of move into the imperial period because that is the Phryne that we have. And so we see the authors in imperial Greek literature turning back to Hellenistic anecdotes, but also classical comedy. And it seems in some senses that they are drawing on comedy through that medium of the pornographic anecdote. So the fragments of comedy that we find in imperial literature, such as the examples featuring Phryne that I touched on previously, they may have survived only in those Hellenistic works on the Hetairai, maybe not as full plays. And that's, something that we can expect with, in the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, the rate of production of epitomes and hypotheses and collections of excerpts. So the imperial period authors are basically taking already fragmented material and then using it as the basis of their fictionalization. So they're turning to this set of sources that has already gone through a process of careful curation with an emphasis on beauty and wit. So we're seeing only those aspects of the Hetairai. So the versions of women like Phryne that we find in imperial literature, the Phryne we saw in the letter from Alciphron, are cultural agents. They represent Athens. And one of my favorite quotes on them comes from Yvonne Roche, who's talking about Alciphron. She calls the Hetairai the pulsating heart of Athens' vast cultural archive. And that's the Phryne that we end up with. So I'd like to close the discussion right now by reflecting on Phryne. Athenaeus is our preserver of so many fragments of all kinds, but especially fragments of comedy and fragments on the Hetairai. In book 13 of Deipnos Sophistae, of course, this is where all of those fragments are because it's all about women and sex workers. And of course, it's been structured as an argument between a cynic and an Athenophile grammarian. And so our cynic presents his argument as invective against both the Hetairai of Athens and against the type of scholarly culture that focuses on classical Athens. Because at this point in literary history, of course, they're inseparable. And in doing so, he's exposing them as being commodities, both Athenian culture and these women. His opponent, who is really the embodiment of Athenian-style paideia, is really, he emphasizes the glamorous liaisons of the Hetairai with notable men. And this is when he earns the insult pornographos, right, which is the earliest preserved use of that term of pornographer. But for him, the Hetairai are really this key means of transmitting and claiming that space of classical Athens, that dreamscape that I talked about earlier. And so his careful selection of classical texts to support his claims, and of course his sort of larger argument that Athenaeus is using here, is something that we can only understand by thinking of it as motivated by nostalgia. And the thing about nostalgia, this quest of desire that can never truly succeed, is that the past can never be fully rematerialized, nor does this nostalgic version of it reward extended examination. And so I argue here that authors like Athenaeus are using fragments and fragmentation and anecdote because they're recognizing the limits of nostalgia. They know that we can never recreate the woman Phryne, but we can have these momentary moments where we envision them, or we have this very transitory nature of nostalgia replicated by the fragments. And so ultimately, what I'm arguing in the book is that when we think of the Hetairai, and when we think of the Hetairai like we find Phryne in Alciphron, we need to understand the intentionality of fragmentation, right? The intentionality that brings us classical Athens and Greek literature in this way, but really also the fragmentation that happens to the narratives of ancient women's lives. And that slow and careful process of curation that we see in the case of Phryne, we can understand it as an act of desire to apprehend, to consume, in a sense, a woman who was in her own lifetime paradoxically powerful and vulnerable simultaneously. And we see the practice of discarding the challenging aspects of the historical woman in favor of what I call the dream girl. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Now we give the word to Stefania Giombini. Thank you, Stefania, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to read my text, so I hope not to be boring to you, okay, for my 10 minutes. The publication of a book dedicated to Phryne marks significant progress in the study of both this character and the history of women in Greece. In recent years, research on women in ancient culture has grown in both quantity and quality. These studies have the important merit of not only rethinking women's roles in ancient communities, but also shedding new light on the complexity of the societies in which they lived. But which women are we focusing on? Most of the women we know have been remembered in our sources and in our memory for specific achievements. These are women who stood out for becoming models, whether positively or negatively. There are the women of philosophy who contributed to the development of thought and are only later discussed in detail. The women of tragedy and comedy, whose symbolic actions shaped ideas about femininity and the relationship between men and women. And the women in law, whose rights and duties were always tied to those of men. To truly understand ancient Greek culture in all its complexity, we can and must reconstruct the experiences and roles of all these women. Melissa's books, Phryne, A Life in Fragments, can be described as comprehensive. This becomes clear right from the chapters that form the main body of the book. The chapter 1, Mneserete to Phryne, chapter 2, Phryne, the artist model, chapter 3, Phryne on trial, and the last one, Phryne's afterlife. Melissa's approach to Phryne goes beyond the simple biography, focusing on her character development and the broader cultural impact of her life on Greek society. Phryne is examined in depth, her origins, her initiation into the role of a Tyra with the adoption of a stage name, and her iconic beauty, which quickly made her a model of physical perfection. This beauty inspired artists like Praxiteles, but also later Apelles, for example, in their work. Phryne's idealized appearance connected her to the divine, particularly Aphrodite, creating a parallel between her physical form and the goddess, which also carried moral significance. All these elements come together in the 5th chapter, where Melissa explores Phryne's trial in detail. Phryne's life and body are central to her trial. Her actions, along with the social and even political role she assumed, were key points of investigation. The book draws on all available sources, which, as we know, mostly come from comic traditions, to interpret a trial surrounded by uncertainties. These include the charges, impiety, and misuse of private funds, and the nature of the court itself. However, there are some established facts: the identity of her accuser, the speakers involved, and the positive verdict. A bold task, making the scholarly work on the subject commendable. Parallel cases, even if not all contemporary, can offer valuable insights. Consider the famous trials of Aspasia and Neaira, both women with backgrounds similar to Phryne's. Although reconstructing Aspasia case is challenging, we know she became Pericles' companion. Okay, we are researching about the married, if there is a real marriage, formal marriage or not. But as a social and indirect political leader, Aspasia was later tried and acquitted. Her past, particularly the possibility that she was a courtesan before her relationship with Pericles, cast a shadow over the case. While it's uncertain if Aspasia was indeed a courtesan, it is clear she was a foreigner who rose to significant prominence in Athens, both socially and intellectually. Similarly, Neaira, also a foreigner and courtesan, faced trial for claiming rights deemed unacceptable by the Athenian community. In the cases of Neaira, Phryne, and Aspasia, the resistance of Athenian citizens to integrating new figures of female power is evident. This power, seen as a threat to the status quo, was often associated with corruption and deceit, making these women subject to public judgment through trial. Phryne belongs to a distinct group, the Tairae, whose social and private roles can be understood within the context of a male-dominated world that created the need for this new female figure. According to Leslie Kirk, a paper inventing the Taira of 1997 in Classical Antiquity, the emergence of the Taira in Greek polis was a response to the aristocratic elites' desire to distance themselves from the pornai, or common prostitutes, who provided only physical services without offering cultural or intellectual companionship. The Tairae, on the other hand, were more refined and exclusive, aligning better with the elite's status. Melissa even suggests that Tairae were essentially, not Melissa, sorry, but Leslie Kirk, so even suggests that Tairae were essentially an invention of the symposium. Tairae lived within this world, fulfilling the fantasies and intellectual needs of Greek men in the classical era. Tairae formed a cohesive group. They were women trained to serve a particular social class of Greek men, occupying a specific social as their most emblematic setting. However, these women also had lives that extended beyond the symposium, and they often established themselves as influential figures within their communities. Like Aspasia, Neaira, Phryne defied the traditional model of the housewife. She escaped male control, becoming a leader in society or within her own household, and for this reason, she stood apart from the uniformity imposed by the society in which she lived. The final chapter of Melissa's book explores how Phryne has also captured the contemporary imagination. Cinema, particularly in 1950s Italy, was notably fascinated by her. In addition to film, various forms of literature have frequently revisited her character. Some literary examples include, for example, the Italian book, the Italian novel Il processo di Phryne, by Eduardo Scarfoglio of 1883, where a beautiful country woman named Maria Antonia is accused of murdering her mother-in-law, outlining the contrast between the protagonist's beauty and the old age of the gossiping mother-in-law. Another example is the recent saga by Carrie Greenwood, Phryne Fisher's Murder Mystery, in which the character is celebrated for her intelligence and wit. Set in the early 20th century, Phryne Fisher becomes a symbol of independence as a private investigator, an activity typically reserved for men at the time. However, perhaps the most intriguing case, from my point of view, of course, is that of a Spanish magazine aimed at women named Phryne. This magazine celebrated homemaking skills, physical appearance, and social etiquette. The name Phryne was chosen not as an ethical paradox, which would have been contradictory, but rather to highlight the autonomy and self-determination embodied by the historical Phryne. To conclude, Melissa's book is a much-needed and an essential addition to scholarly literature. Its arrival can only be welcomed with enthusiasm, as it fills a crucial gap in the field and provides valuable new perspectives. So thanks, Melissa, for your book, and thanks to all.
You, Stefania. Grazie. Well, now we still have 20 or even 30 minutes, but I would like first to give the word to Caterina and Katharine to comment on Sara's comments. And after this, to Melissa to comment on Stefania's remarks. So please, Katharine and Caterina, feel free to have the word.
Sure, I'll say something briefly and then I'll get the thank you so much, Sara, for your generous comments about the book, and especially in light of your wonderful volume with Catherine McKean in the Routledge series, which is even more culturally and historically expansive than ours. So it means a great deal that you found it useful in this way. And thank you for mentioning Rosa Antoniazza, to whom we dedicate the introduction, who was a dear friend and influence for both Caterina and I. And thinking about this forging of critical distance is a really lovely way to progress the discussion. I wanted to just take up one point of your many wonderful points about this, the non-neutrality of the focus on singular thinkers. It's something that I've been thinking about more recently. So, it just sparks conversation. And then I was thinking about it again during Melissa's comments, because, you're talking about Phryne as this object of desire, the desire for the whole that becomes sparked as a result of seeing these fragmentary parts. And there is this very interesting conflict, I think, between, on the one hand, when we work on figures like Phryne or Arete or Percione or Sulaba or Ban Shao, in some ways, we become so interested in them. We become interested in their lives as they're philosophical and as the elements of their lives impact the material that we have and that we don't have. So on the one hand, we're sort of in the introduction and in our individual chapters arguing for the philosophical relevance of lives, not just in terms of autobiography as evidence of philosophical lives, but in terms of the material constituents of a life being important to, for example, the content of some of this philosophy. Perhaps it's domesticated in some way or domestic, and that's important. We have people like Dorota Deutsch, who's doing this wonderful work on women as artifacts and thinking about the woman as a representation and an idea. We have, the nature of a philosophical life being perhaps importantly represented by a gendered perspective in some cases. And in some ways, when I teach this material, I want my students to perhaps hero worship these figures in the same way that they might Plato and Aristotle. I want them to fall in love with the ideas and maybe even the lives of these women. But then there's this idea of resisting that focus on individual thinkers, and what do we do when we pull away from that, and what can we gain from thinking about the limits of that kind of attribution, and what is lost if we over focus on this talk regarding the limits of nostalgia in this very interesting way. And so I mean, I just wanted to open that up for discussion. You know, what do we do with that? Plato and Aristotle, Sarah brings up this amazing question of what results in terms of a shift in our thinking when we turn back to Plato and Aristotle and other canonical figures after having thought about these issues. Women philosophers haven't had the chance for the hero worship yet. So are we too quick if we want to pull away from that? And I'm really, I'm interested in this. I don't have a closed answer for this. I have some thoughts about it, but I really just wanted to open that up. It's just a brilliant question that I'd be very interested in Melissa and others' views on. And I'll stop talking there. Others can say.
Thanks, Katharine. That's a great question. And thank you, Sara. Thank you very much. I only have 2 points very quickly before passing on to Melissa. You mentioned this, what we do in the introduction, and going back to Antognazza, so the idea of the possible value of the study of women philosophers for the history of philosophy. So when we were writing this, one thing I was, in a sense, struggling with was that I didn't want to give the impression that oh, we studied these women and this book has value, or this field has value, insofar as it teaches us something about how we can then about the canonical figures, how to approach the canonical figures, and so on. So on the one hand, we wanted to convey the idea that the study of women philosophers has a value in itself. On the other hand, however, there were sort of 2 things that we noticed, to things that we wanted to avoid. So on the one hand, we did notice that a lot of what we were doing in working on with the sources and reflecting on the sources was raising questions that scholars ask elsewhere, for example, if they work on the pre-Socratics, or that some of our contributors came up with methodology that, so Katharine in her chapter has a very sort of methodological sections on working with sort of letters and problems of authenticity and so on, that we could then use elsewhere. So the links were there. And the field immediately appeared as intertwined with ancient philosophy more broadly, and so we wanted to highlight this. And then also the other point was, very often it has happened to me. So at the beginning, when I was teaching sort of ancient philosophy in general, I wanted to teach the women philosophers as well, but the result was sort of adding a lecture on women philosophers, sort of an appendix or something like that, an afterthought. And I understand why people might do that, but also just sort of pragmatically. But again, we wanted this not to be sort of a topic in itself, intertwined with ancient philosophy more broadly. And then the other thing that you mentioned was about epistemic injustice, and so this idea of, which is something I've been thinking about recently. So you said it very nicely. So the lack of vocabulary that impoverishes our experience, and with women philosophers, we have various versions of this sort of injustice. On the one hand, lack of evidence, so some sort of silencing. On the other hand, this indirect reports that portray women in a certain way, just as mothers, or as hetairai, or as and not as intellectuals, so that they're not presented as knowledge givers in a sense. So again, I don't really, how do we fill this lacuna? On the one hand, I guess the first step would be to realize that the way we study ancient philosophy, or the sources that we have are defective, intellectually defective in some way. So step one, realization, but ideally you want to do something something more, and also try to add this vocabulary that has been missing. But I mean, that's maybe up for discussion. But yeah, no, thank you very much for your comments. And for, again, the work that you did in your volume, which also reflects a lot on the unconventional sources, which again leads us back to Melissa and what she was saying about fragments. So this reflecting on the medium and not just the content, I thought was fascinating. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Sara, any comment? It's okay.
I don't want to take up room from Melissa, but other than to say thank you, and I'm really looking forward to further conversation as we move along. Yeah, thank you both.
Okay, thank you. So Melissa, comments on Stefania talk?
Well, thank you, Stefania, and especially for letting me know about the Spanish magazine. So one of the problems is when you work on a project like this that is so sort of broad, you're always coming up with more that you could have talked about or want to talk about, but there's something else for me to look into, so I'm very pleased. So something that you said earlier when you were talking about Aspasia and Neaira and their trials is that there was sort of a failure to integrate properly, in some sense, into Athenian society. And then this is something that I was thinking about when Sara was speaking earlier, because she was talking about invisibility as a strategy for a livable life, right? And a woman like Phryne, she was so visible, and that is sort of encoded into those stories about her nude body being revealed, right? Like that's a metaphor for the visibility that she had. So that's something that I wanted to touch on. I didn't speak about it very much today. I do talk about it in the book, but this idea that these women who are largely foreign, right? They're very unconventional, and they end up in court. And that's actually where I would argue sort of the beginning of their cultural print is them being brought to court, because it's very clear that the comedies in the 4th century are responding to their presence in the courtroom. And we know, for example, that there was a play called Neaira. There were plays that seem to tell the story of trials. We have little tiny fragments of those. But it goes back again to that failure to integrate, that if you're not integrating, we will sort of forcibly do something with you. And that also goes back to the desire for women like this in their own lifetime, in that it makes them powerful in a sense. It allows them some of them to accrue wealth, but there's clearly a discomfort on the part of mainstream society with that desire. And so the legal system becomes a means of digesting it and dealing with these women and sort of putting them back in their place, so to speak, whatever that place might be, or at least reflecting that they haven't integrated. And I also think about Alison Glazberg has her recent book on sexual labor in the Athenian courts, and the way she talks about the social mobility of sex workers that we see in these speeches that isn't available to mainstream Athenian women. And so that to me is sort of the key to understanding why so much attention gets paid to them, and then why they end up in the comedies, and then why this literary tradition begins, right? I think that really the courts are the key to that. And so that was something that I was sort of seeing resonating across our discussions of unconventional women, right, in some way, and the strategies that they're using in the ancient world, and how we can, in a sense, trace them. And I think Caterina was mentioning that too, possibly Katharine, just this idea that, you know, we do not have straightforward biographies, but within the way the stories are told, we can find some elements of social history of these women and start thinking about perhaps why the stories that we do have are told in the way that they are told. And I think that concludes my thoughts there, but thank you. And thanks to all of you, because I really am having these moments of great resonance.
Thank you, Melissa. I don't know, Jacqueline, if you would like to make any comment.
No, I have no comment, but it was very interesting. Thank you. But someone, Maria Navarro, wanted to speak. Have you seen? She I have seen a hand, but not now, but
Okay.
before.
Oh,
Maybe
I'm sorry. I
she
didn't.
want
Uh-huh.
to react.
Uh-huh. Okay. Is she still there?
Yes, but may I have
Yeah.
seen her hand, but now not. So I don't know.
Maria Navarro, would you like to make any comment? Well,
But no, finally.
okay.
Okay.
I don't know if I would like to point to a question or comments. I was thinking when Sara talked about invisible, perhaps, or the silence in women. I was wondering how to compare this, for instance, when a man desires not to be invisible, but not to be, for instance, readable. I was wondering about Socrates, when a man decides not to do something and how to evaluate this methodologically with women desire of, for instance, not being visible or for social reasons, etc. And also this other question is made into Melissa about the fragments as a kind of genre and also gender. um, so also how to think about the pre-Socratics as a fragmentary philosophy. How do you deal this? Would you deal this with these two difference or some similarities that could be made too? Could be made. Thank you.
Should I begin with I'll answer the second question and then we can move on to the bigger one. I'm glad that you brought up the pre-Socratics because in a sense, they've actually been quite influential on my work, or work on the pre-Socratics has been influential. So I mentioned the work of Camelia Elias, and she traces the fragment across eras, but she begins with Heraclitus, and that's how begins sort of musing about fragments, and that's where her idea of the coercive fragment that's been very influential, that's been coerced into separation. But the other thing with the pre-Socratics, and I cannot remember the name of the author who wrote this book. It was a book from the 80s, but she's one of the first people in working on fragments who says we have to look at the context. We can't just extract the fragments and do this philological work. We have to think about the process that gets us these fragments. I can't believe I forgot her name, but anyways, but I think that because they are sort of our first big body of fragmentary literature, that they offer us so many models for how to then deal with other bodies of fragmented literature. So we might even think about that as a kind of genre too, the way that those philosophical fragments have been preserved. With the Hetairai, there is such a very clear sort of literary record there. So I think we can more safely argue for a genre, but I think perhaps the same could be true of the pre-Socratics, to think about that as its own genre and to think about what the expectations are for a fragment of pre-Socratic philosophy, right? What we would expect to be, how it's preserved, where it's preserved, how long it is, right? Is it brief? Is it not? All of that, I think, is very important to the larger conversation.
Yeah, if you just allowed me a comment, perhaps reinforcing this, I wonder in some author like Gorgas, who worked with also about the women, and so this relation between genre and gender in his case, because it's curious how always he was, or in many books on history of philosophy, this to just to get, for instance, the Dioscurans fragment and not to contextualize it. And if you go, for instance, to a testament like Cestus Empiricus, Gorgias is not among the rhetoricians, but among the logicians. How this changed our perspective, and even our perspective in the other texts regarding, in the case of Helen, for instance. It's just a general comment that reinforced this idea. Thank you.
On the invisibility point that you made, I thought this was a really interesting comment of Sara, and I think I have to think about it more. But in general, so it's very difficult to deal with silence or invisibility, because on the one hand, you shouldn't take it as an excuse also to discard whoever figure he isn't writing or he isn't mentioned. But on the on the other hand, you have an opportunity to reflect on this silence, on this invisibility, as much as you would on words. On the other hand, it's difficult not to sort of make arguments from silence and so on. So, but what you said about writing, again, this was something that we had in mind when working on these figures, and that I had to. So I worked on the Pythagorean women, and Pythagoras himself doesn't write. So the again, that was an issue that I faced. This is because the very fact that there are no writings is problematic, obviously, but also it is not as problematic for other figures, such as Socrates, such as well, some pre-Socratics for whom we only have one fragment, such as some Hellenistic philosophers, such as Pythagoras, and so on. It is true that it's slightly different for two reasons. For in the case of Socrates, we have a lot more that was written about him. On the other hand, in the case of women philosophers, we have this the gender factor that it has to be taken into account. So I guess to me it is another example of how first of all, the problems that we encounter working on women philosophers are problems that we encounter as well elsewhere. The strategies are strategies that we use or can use or should use elsewhere, and even though sort of silence and invisibility is a problem, it is also an opportunity for reflection, more than as it has been for some figures and not for others in the case of women philosophers. But I don't know, Katharine, if you want to add something.
Really, just to echo this interesting question of, I think your comparison with Socrates is unreadable is a really apt one. We have the problem of, women's work, women's ideas not being preserved, questions about whether facts about their lives, as much as we can recover them, are germane to thinking about their philosophical ideas. And on the other hand, we have a figure like Socrates, where nothing is preserved, at least that's not, very contested, and an absolute acceptance that we should pursue every crumb about his life as philosophically relevant and interesting and worth mining, and no question that any aspect of his life would be of interest in a philosophy course, for example, for students to think about. So that it's a nice comparison, because it reveals how willing in some cases we are to accept as evidence of the philosophical these other aspects of one's life, community, working practices, working conditions, when it comes to figures who are canonical, and on the other hand, how much resistance there is to doing that unless and until a figure is considered canonical. And in the case of many women philosophers of the period, in order to establish that they ought to be part of the canon, we first have to do that mining work. So I guess, in some ways it does come back to this question of the order in which we do things. One of the conclusions was to say, let's not focus too much on individuals, but when it comes to women philosophers, I think there has to be a moment where we can focus on them as individuals first, before we can then move away to the communal, because they haven't had their moment yet, their moment of recovery or their moment of focus. And then, once we're in that nice position, then we can move to what community were they part of, what other marginalized voices are we, might we be understanding the views of by virtue of thinking about them, before we move away from a kind of romanticizing of that figure, which male figures have had the advantage of for, a long time. So yeah, thank you for that comparison.
Thank you too. Stefania?
Yes, just one thing, because it's very interesting, this topic, about invisibility and the sources and so on. I just want to add that the problem are not just the sources. We have sources. For example, about Phryne, I wrote a chapter of a book about Phryne and the trial. We have many sources. So the problem are not the source in their selves, but also for me, the historical and philosophical and doxographical tradition, because we know that the first histories of philosophy in the modern age truth, Diogenes Laertius' work. So in Diogenes Laertius' work, there are practically no women. So we have a problem with the tradition, not just with the sources. Just this. Thank you.
Thank you too. Nice comment too. Well, more questions or comments? Let me see. Matthew, please.
Yeah, I'd like to thank everyone else also for these wonderful presentations. I wanted to ask, I've been thinking about the position of Cavallero and Nonostante Platone. Is there a place for us for this kind of sort of tendentious reading to try to fill in the gaps when we say, she's sort of angry at the Western philosophical tradition and wants to read against the grains, and is that something that we can continue to do, or how does that fit within this next step of studying ancient women philosophers that we've had recently?
Thank you very much. Yes, so Cavallero, I mean, it's a step now in the study of women in ancient philosophy and possibly of sort of feminist philosophy of ancient philosophy. I mean, I think you're right in pointing. I mean, I think there's always a space for and a place for these various different attitudes towards the philosophical tradition. So when you thinking about feminism and ancient philosophy or women in ancient philosophy, there are various things that you can do. You can sort of what Katharine and I were trying to do, and was to look at, or what Sara Brill does in her volume, was to think about the women philosophers, but you can still study what ancient philosophers said about women and highlight various aspects of it, those that you disagree with, and those and more in line with Cavallero, and those that could still be sort of useful for a feminist rereading of the history of philosophy. So, I mean, it was what Cavallero does is different from what we do, but not because we sort of think that this is the next step or the only thing that you can do when you're thinking about women and ancient philosophy. So ideally, there's sort of still room for various different sorts of engagement. I mean, very often when I read about women philosophers, people take into account Cavallero's view and her criticism, and so it's still very foundational, I would say. But I don't know if you have any ideas.
Okay, thank you again. Well, more questions and comments? No? If not, we have 3 minutes only. So I would like just to of you for this opportunity you gave us to discuss and to devote the books. So thank you very much for the authors, for the respondents, and for Jacqueline to host in this project, and for the assistants also, Caio and Daniela. So let's meet, if possible, in November to our last session in the year, tomorrow to the comments of two books. So thank you very much again, and goodbye for now. Bye.